Jen, thank you for coming onto the show. It is always a special pleasure to welcome a fellow Pittsburgher onto the show. You grew up in the same neighborhood I did, of Squirrel Hill, teaching at the University of Pittsburgh. You're also an expert on Central Asia, where you mastered many of the languages. I wanted to ask you, since you're visiting Washington, D.C., what do you think is the significance of the C5+1 conference that President Trump will be participating in?
So, before we get started on the significance, I want your viewers to understand what is the C5+1. So this is a convening of the 5 Central Asian republics, hence the C5, and +1 is the United States. So it's a C5+1 format, which was first established actually by President Obama in 2015 under the Obama administration. So this was a platform to get the states of Central Asia to work together on issues of common concern. At that time, it was mostly counterterrorism issues, some human rights issues, border issues, and so forth.
So Obama was particularly interested in the anti-terrorism efforts, I take it.
Yes, yes. So that platform began at that stage, and Central Asia was in a very different place at that time. You recall 2014, the U.S. began its transition from its military the military involvement. The U.S. still had a military presence, but they were no longer doing, they were handing things over to the Afghan military. So the U.S. was just in a support role. So the role of Central Asia became even more important to secure the region. The challenge is that you have these 5 republics who really struggled to work together for many, many years. And these are the newly independent post-Soviet republics. So this C5+1 format was intended to allow the United States not only to cooperate with all of them, elevate their importance in Washington, but also to encourage them to work with one another.
Now, has that been efficacious? Has it actually occurred?
So some really interesting things have happened along the way. 2016, Islam Karimov, who was the president of Uzbekistan, passed away. And he was a very inward-looking authoritarian leader who promoted autarky. Now, why does that matter? Because if you look at the geography of Central Asia, Uzbekistan touches on all 5 Central Asian states, and I'm including Afghanistan among them. So Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. It shares a border with all of them. So if you have this one country that's closed off, that makes it very difficult to trade with neighbors, you're going to have enormous challenges promoting regional cooperation, regional integration. His successor has opened things up in remarkable ways, Shavkat Mirziyoyev. That has transformed the nature of the region from one of countries looking inward, very suspicious of one another, to those that are now willing to cooperate. So the platform now is in a much better place than it was because, especially since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, countries in the region now understand why it is important that they cooperate. They're in a neighborhood where they're dominated by Russia and China.
Particularly Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan shares a border with Russia, and recall that Putin called Kazakhstan an artificial state.
And they have a lot of uranium deposits as well that we rely on in the United States.
Yes, uranium, gas, oil, substantial American investment. Most of the American investment in Central Asia is in Kazakhstan. So the rare earths, all of these rare minerals that are now very important. And China dominates, right, the rare earth sector. So right now, one of the issues on this agenda for this meeting are these rare earth minerals. And
which have become super important.
Have become very, very important. So the question is whether the United States can leverage any kind of influence to encourage the Central Asians to do business with the United States, whereas the position of the Central Asian states is, we want to do business with everyone. They've all adopted this kind of multi-vector, which they call multi-vector foreign policy. They don't want to pick sides. This is what they always say. We don't want to pick sides. We're constrained by our geography. Russia and China are right there. They're going to be their major trading partners, always. We can't ask the Central Asian states to eschew cooperation with China. But the Central Asians are looking to hedge their bets, right? They're looking for outsiders who can kind of weaken the influence of Russia and China, soften it, give them more alternatives, but also open transport corridors that allow them to get around these two states. And most of the transport corridors historically have gone through Russia.
Now, what about President Trump and the Trump administration? Have they recognized the significance of Central Asia, and are they doing a good job in dealing with the region?
So we didn't see much action with this C5 platform during the Biden administration. And there was a new strategy towards Central Asia that was rolled out during the first Trump administration, I believe under McMaster, during that period of time. There was a new strategy, but it was still very much an appendage of Afghan strategy. Now, with the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, we see a very changed region. And what the Trump administration is trying to do by bringing them to Washington is to elevate their importance. So this platform has happened for many years, right? It's happened. We've seen these meetings since 2015. This is the first time they've happened in Washington, not in the region. And often they happen in the region with, Secretary of State, or they happen with an undersecretary. But this is the first time President Trump has invited all of them to Washington to meet. So what he's done is elevate the importance nationally here in the United States. And I think these issues of rare earth minerals, commerce, trade, also Russia and China is quite important. So the more these countries cooperate, the more leverage they have together to buffer themselves from Chinese and Russian influence.
Now, at the University of Pittsburgh, you also occupy another hat, which is, I believe you were part of an anti-Semitism task force at the university, because there have been issues and incidents. I wanted to ask you first, the Israeli war in Gaza obviously created, there was a lot of protests in the United States, particularly on campuses, which the Trump administration has tried to counter. And there is then the war in the Gaza Strip. I wanted to ask you two questions. First, do you think that the Trump administration moved effectively on American campuses? And second, do you think that the Trump administration's support of Israel during the Gaza war was fruitful and the right course to follow?
So these are two very different questions. So with regard to Trump administration's strategy to combating anti-Semitism on campuses, he used a sledgehammer to get universities to wake up and begin to address these issues. And he got everyone's attention. I think, however, the challenge with the strategy that he used is that it penalized the university in many different aspects. So it cut back science funding and NIH funding, and there are many different aspects to how he did this, and also applied it selectively to a few universities, of course, many of the Ivy Leagues. But he did put the universities on watch. And there have been other cuts to universities. For example, NIH funding. There have been really changes in the models that the way that the universities, the way that the federal government will now support universities. And often people are conflating this with the anti-Semitism work, and they're very different issues. So I don't think it's been as effective as it could have been. I think it could have been more targeted, and targeted on the issues that really, where the universities really face these challenges. So penalizing, the sciences where a lot of this basic and applied research is done, I'm not sure how that helps, but it has put the universities, it's certainly been a wake-up call, and to ensure that they address these issues in a serious manner.
How do you distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism?
It's very, very simple. Any criticism of Israel is legitimate. Period. You can criticize Israel left and right. It becomes problematic when you suggest that Israel doesn't have the right to exist as a state. That's the difference between legitimate. There is any criticism of Israel is legitimate. The question is, when you question the right of Israel to exist, that's when we get into anti-Semitism. And so how do we know it's anti-Semitic? When you apply the standard only to one country. So I work on Central Asia for many years. I have worked advocating for the plight of the Muslim Uyghurs in Western China. I have never heard any call on my campus to eliminate the state of China because of the genocide of the Uyghurs. And I want to remind everyone that both President Biden and President Trump said that this was a genocide, right? So I didn't see protests on campus. I tried to organize convenings and raise awareness of this, but I never saw anyone calling for the defunding of China, the deplatforming of China. Other states face challenges. Israel certainly faced challenges, and we can have discussions about the Trump administration strategy towards Gaza, which is a question that you asked. These are good questions. But when we say that Israel doesn't have the right to exist, and solely Israel as a state that is somehow uniquely evil
and illegitimate,
when we question its legitimacy, or when we call it an ethno-state, right? These are other terms that I hear. Well, Romania is also an ethno-state. Kazakhstan is an ethno-state. I just read this morning in Kyrgyzstan, they're taking down signs in foreign languages, so you can only have signs in Kyrgyz. That is an ethno-state, but I've not yet heard anyone call for the dismantling of Kyrgyzstan.
Now, have you, in Squirrel Hill, where we grew up, is a heavily Jewish neighborhood, and there was the attack on the Tree of Life synagogue, which garnered international headlines. Have you noticed since then manifestations of anti-Semitism in Pittsburgh itself?
We have an unfortunate problem with anti-Semitism in Pittsburgh, but it is not unique to Pittsburgh. Squirrel Hill is unique because it remains one of the few remaining urban Jewish communities in the United States. I think New York and Pittsburgh are the last two remaining urban communities. Most of the Jews in the United States moved out to the suburbs in the 1950s, 1960s. So there's a high concentration of Jews in a very small community. And so we become targets. And of course, the shooting at Tree of Life, which was very painful, both you and I grew up at that synagogue. I knew many of the people who perished, and it was very painful. But one of the balms that came out of that was the fact that the community wrapped its arms around us afterwards. The shooter was from the right wing. He had some white replacement theory. The Jews were... Anyway, so it was the entire community wrapped its arms around us. So the whiplash after October 7th was brutal, because the same people who said that they supported us, that they would stand by us, would stand up to anti-Semitism at any cost, were the same ones blaming the Jewish community for the anti-Semitism. One local imam who I used to work with on issues on the Uyghurs at a public hearing said the Jews deserved all the anti-Semitism that we get because of our support for the state of Israel. It's been very painful to see that. Now that's at a political level. Blaming the victim. And then at the community level, my own home has been targeted twice with anti-Semitic vitriol because I have this position at the university. I'm subject to online attacks, doxing, put on websites, because I'm happy to stand up for all of my colleagues, including my Israeli colleagues, including my Jewish colleagues.
Do you feel you've become a figure of controversy on campus?
I don't think so. I'm here to do my work, and it's unfortunate that there's much more anti-Semitism than we had imagined. And it comes from the left, and that's the manifestation that we'll see on college campuses. And it comes from the right, and that's what we saw at Tree of Life. And
and at the Heritage Foundation, or with this Nick Fuentes episode.
Yes, so it comes from Heritage, Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, you name it. It has a place on the right. what's been shocking for me as a professor is to see the way that it's manifested itself in our institutions of higher learning, sort of the withering heights of culture and society. These are the institutions that are supposed to be training the next generation of leaders and that have been infested with anti-Semitism. And it's a very serious thing, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. It's not going to disappear with the ceasefire in Gaza. I think this is a social disease that we have to be very clear about what it is, how it manifests itself, and we cannot be blind to only see the hatred that comes from the opposite side of the political spectrum where we sit. So academics in universities tend to be very left-wing. It's very easy for us to see right-wing anti-Semitism. Conservatives have no problem calling out anti-Semitism on the left wing, right? On the left side of the political spectrum. And they'll call that out. We have to not take, this isn't a political problem. This is a very serious social problem. And it's not one, as I said, that's going to go away anytime soon.
Now let's move to the issue. You're moving to Israel. You've got a Fulbright fellowship, moving there with your family, which should be a very
God willing.
exciting
Yes.
venture.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm wondering how you felt about the Gaza war itself, and which did certainly lead to a lot of these tensions in the United States and internationally as well. How do you think Trump handled it?
Well, I think Trump tried to bring an end to the war. And I think he tried to steward, so we can talk about the war and we can talk about the peace agreement. And as someone who studied civil conflicts, civil wars, I spent many years in Afghanistan. I've written 2 books on Afghanistan and the conflict there, and also extensively on post-conflict reconstruction. So I think the way that President Trump brought a ceasefire, I think the war still hasn't ended. I think it's too early to say the war has ended. We have a ceasefire right now, and we're waiting for Hamas to make good on its promises, right, to return the bodies and then disarm. I think the agreement that President Trump was able to orchestrate was one of the most masterful acts of foreign policy that we've seen in decades, because he was able to address the problems on the ground, but also the problems in the region simultaneously. And the cards came out all at the same time. So, one of the criticisms that the Israeli government received about the war was that there was never a day after plan. And I'm going to tie this into President Trump's strategy, right? This is important. There was never a day after plan. Because to me, you can't have a day after plan until you understand how the conflict is going to end. And could you have a day after plan, for example, before Yahya Sinwar was killed? That day after plan would look a lot different from the one you have after he was killed. And when the Israeli military was approaching Gaza City, it was pretty clear how the war would end. This would be the last stand. This would be the end of the war, the last battle in this war. And Hamas clearly didn't want this, and neither did the regional players. So it was becoming clear how this conflict between the two parties would end. And at that point, you can more credibly commit to a day after plan. So that's why it was remarkable to see so many of the Arab countries come together at the same time, and that the United States was able to get their commitment to this 20-point or 21-point plan. That was remarkable because they all put their cards on the table, including Turkey and Qatar, that they would commit to this. And so at that moment, not only did you have an understanding what the end of the war would look like, but you also had a day after plan that empirically followed the realities on the ground, right? You can construct, for 20 years, the United States was fighting in Afghanistan and Central Asia for beautiful reconstruction plans, beautiful day after plans, but there was no clear understanding of what the end of the war looked like. There was no clear picture of what victory looked like. And I think what the Israelis did is they laid out, this is what victory will look like. And they shared it with the world. Here's what it looks like. They were very clear about that. The United States in those two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, were never clear about what victory looks like, yet we're busy implementing and fighting for endless, costly day-after plans. So this is one of the key differences that I really want people to think about when they're thinking about this war, thinking about the reconstruction effort and what's going to follow.
This is very interesting and quite, it's prompting a lot of new thoughts about this conflict.
Sending us in a different direction,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
I wanted to ask you as a final question, what do you hope to accomplish when you go to Israel on your Fulbright?
Oh, so about the Fulbright. So what I'll be working on are questions of regional integration and regional cooperation. And I'm working with Ronit Levine at Tel Aviv University.
Who's written for the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, in fact.
She has, and she's got a vision for a Middle Eastern Union. And so very similar to President Trump's vision, she has a bottom-up and a top-down strategy for how we can achieve peace in the Middle East, both between Israel and the Palestinians and also among countries in the region, that when Israel is really recognized as a beating heart of the Middle East.
So this would build on the Abraham Accords.
This will build on the work on the Abraham Accords. And so the idea is can we think about extending the Abraham Accords? One of the phrases Ronit loves to use is the Abraham Alliance. Can we extend the Abraham Accords into an Abraham Alliance? So we're going to be studying these kinds of alliances in historical perspective, but also in contemporary perspective. So I want to take us back to where we started, which was the C5+1. So in many ways, the regional cooperation that we're seeing in Central Asia
You think could be duplicated in the Middle East?
reminds me of the Abraham Accords. And in fact, I think some of the aspects of that, the Central Asians may be mimicking. Why? The drivers behind it are quite similar. What was the impetus for the Abraham Accords? Well, a lot of it had to do, of course, with benefits from trade and cooperation and normalization of Israel. But another factor had to do with Iran, Russia, right? So this axis, but especially Iran for countries in the Middle East. In Central Asia, you see the same thing. As we discussed in the very beginning, what's driving integration in Central Asia? Well, they don't want to be completely dominated by Russia, China. Iran is there. They're surrounded by countries under sanction, right? The Central Asian states have to face a sanctioned Afghanistan to the south, sanctioned Iran to the southwest, and heavily sanctioned Russia to the north. So they're looking for all available alternatives, want to be friends with everyone, and want to find a way to work together, strengthen their own cooperation to secure their own place in the world. So I don't think that, and if we look around the world in Eastern Europe, I think we're seeing similar dynamics as well because of Russia. So when regions are faced with these hegemonic powers who are not necessarily very nice to deal with, you're beginning to see impetus and a spark for people to work together in very unexpected ways.
Well, Jen, at a moment of what almost looks like unprecedented turmoil and turbulence on the international scene, it is reassuring to hear your optimistic view of where things could be headed.
We have to be optimistic.
We'll have to discuss this again next time, and thank you for coming on.
What a pleasure. Thank you.